Giving people a minute to get settled. I see Carlotta just joined us, and I suspect we'll have some more people joining us as we get started. This is Jennifer Fenton from the Washington State Library, and welcome to First Tuesdays, and we're very glad you are here with us. We have with us today Carolyn, is one of our facilitators and coordinators, and myself, Jennifer. We have our technical support team, Nan and Jeremy, and they are here. So if you are having any problems seeing or hearing, these are our go-to guys. So go ahead and make a note of their contact information. And this program is brought to you by Washington State Library and the Institute of Museum and Library Services. So we'll just go ahead and take a quick poll here to see who's all is here. If you can type in chat your name and your library. I think we know each other for the most part, but Katie and John, our presenters today, would like to know who all is here. So if you can go ahead and type in chat, as I see you are doing, we will see where people are joining us from. Gina is joining us from Anacortes. Carlotta and Anna are joining us from Walla Walla Rural, two different libraries, the Touche branch. I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation. And then the district. So welcome to all of you. So we have some great representation from different kinds of libraries. And I suspect we'll have more people slipping in as time goes on. So now it's my pleasure to turn this over to, okay, thank you, Carlotta. To turn this over to our presenters today, we have Katie and John, and they have done this program at conferences, a variation of it, and it's been so popular that Carolyn and I were like, maybe we could ask them to present a First Tuesdays for us, and they graciously agreed. So we are thrilled to have Katie Irons from Pierce County Library and John Fawcett from Kitsap Regional Library. And they are here to tag team and share with you some viewers advisory information. So we're going to turn away from books today and focus on films. Please welcome Katie and John.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I'm sorry about jumping the gun there, I am Katie Irons from Pierce County Library. I've been selecting AV for 12 years now, I think, for the Pierce County Library. And I'm with John Fawcett, who's the collection manager at Kitsap Regional Library, but who also has a long history in selecting their AV collection. And as I said earlier, one of the things that John and I had come to experience in our time in libraries is that library staff especially seems a lot more comfortable recommending books to patrons than they do films, even if they don't personally have an interest in horror, they know where the Stephen King books are. But when it comes to helping people find movies, a lot of staff people just kind of throw up their hands and are like, I don't know. And if they're lucky, they have maybe a film expert on staff who kind of gets thrown all those questions, which is great for everyone except the film expert who is constantly having to field questions. And so I think John and I both felt that it's just very important for library staff to know some basic things about movies, even if you don't consider yourself personally a film expert, even if you don't watch very much film, even if you only watch certain kinds of films. And so this presentation is about giving you some titles to have in your back pocket, as it were, to help you when you get those questions from patrons. So I'm going to start talking to you about comedy today. Comedy is obviously one of the oldest dramatic forms, and as soon as they invented film, they started filming people slipping on banana peels. I was actually so overwhelmed at the thought of picking out just five comedies or six for this program that I actually ended up sitting down and making a list of all my comedies and putting them into different categories of the different kinds of comedies, and then trying to pick ones from different kinds of comedies. I treated it very much like a librarian exercise. This is the result then. The Awful Truth is a screwball comedy, which was directed by Leo McCarey in 1937. Along with Frank Capra, McCarey was one of the most popular and well-loved directors of the 1930s and 40s. It was Leo McCarey who originally paired Stan Laurel with Oliver Hardy, and he perfected a kind of frenetic, breakneck speed comedy which became his trademark. The Awful Truth is a textbook example of the screwball romantic comedy. Irene Dunne and Cary Grant star as a couple driven apart by unfounded jealousy, who then immediately begin interfering with their respective new romances. Grant's physical comedy is often balletic in this film, and I have always felt that Irene Dunne is underappreciated in the history of Hollywood, and she was not afraid to do anything for a laugh. Oh, and I wanted to say, I'm sorry, in my introduction, that John and I are glad to answer questions if we can kind of wait till the end, and then we'll take whatever questions people have. So Some Like It Hot is a farce, directed by Billy Wilder in 1959. Some Like It Hot is the story of two musicians, played by Jack Lemmon and Tony Curtis, who unintentionally witness a mob murder. Fearing for their lives and desperate for work, they disguise themselves as women and go on the road with Sweet Sue and her Society Syncopators Orchestra, whereupon they both instantly fall in love with the lead singer, Sugar Kane, played by Marilyn Monroe and looking, as it says in the movie, like Jell-O on stilts. They come up with increasingly complicated ways to woo her without giving away their identities. Some Like It Hot was a huge hit, although it was condemned by the Roman Catholic Legion of Decency and banned in Kansas. Some think it is the best work of Marilyn Monroe's career, and sadly it was close to her last. She only had 2 films left after this. And even though men dressing as women is the stuff of Saturday morning cartoons nowadays, this movie is still very funny and very subversive, and some of the best comedic work all 3 of these actors have ever done. In 2009, Michael Hoffman would direct the Oscar-nominated film The Last Station, which is an ensemble film about the life of Leo Tolstoy. But in 1991, Hoffman gave us an ensemble comedy about the inner workings of a soap opera in Soap Dish. Clearly one can see a direct line between Tolstoy and American soap operas. Ensemble comedies like Soap Dish are those films that have a cast of thousands and a series of interlocking plot lines. Woody Allen is known for the ensemble film, as is Christopher Guest, with films like Best in Show and Waiting for Guffman. And Soap Dish stars Sally Field, Kevin Kline, Whoopi Goldberg, Robert Downey Jr., Carrie Fisher, and Terry Hatcher, to name but a few. Oh, whoops. One reviewer said that Soap Dish is like Network crossed with Beyond the Valley of the Dolls. It is full of side-splitting one-liners that you will want to repeat to all your friends, but that will be silly because the movie is 20 years old and no one will know what you're talking about. Believe me, I know. Shaun of the Dead is a parody directed by Edgar Wright in 2004. Shaun of the Dead could realistically be called a horror film or an action film because it's both of those. As you can see, the tagline says it's a romantic comedy with zombies, which it also is. It's a parody of zombie films, which honestly seems like a genre that would be almost impossible to satirize. The key to Shaun of the Dead's success, in my opinion, is that unlike some other horror satire flicks, like Scary Movie, Shaun of the Dead has a very engrossing plot and characters that exist to tell a story, and not just to make fun of other stories. There's clearly a love and a respect for the zombie genre in this movie. Shaun and his buddy Ed like to spend all their free time at the pub, a hobby that has begun to wear on the nerves of Ed's girlfriend Liz. And in the midst of figuring out how to get Liz back, they realize that London is under attack from a zombie plague, and the obvious solution is to go fetch Liz and Shaun's mom Barbara and take them to the safe haven of the local pub. In 2007, Edgar Wright directed the stars of Shaun, Simon Pegg and Nick Frost in the very entertaining satire of buddy cop flicks Hot Fuzz. And Wright also directed the critical darling of last year, Scott Pilgrim versus the World. And Simon Pegg and Nick Frost were involved in the space alien comedy Paul, which came out last year, or possibly this year. I'm sorry, I can't remember. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang is a noir comedy, and it was directed in 2005 by Shane Black. Black is best known for writing the Lethal Weapons films. Black was the screenwriter to beat in the late 80s, early 90s, and Hollywood just could not stop giving him money. But Black became overwhelmed by the Hollywood machine. He stopped writing and disappeared for about a decade. He returned with Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, which he was determined to direct himself. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang is an old-school noir detective movie mated with a screwball buddy comedy. Downey Jr. stars as a petty thief who, for reasons that make perfect sense in the movie, gets mistaken for an actor auditioning for the part of a petty thief. He's cast, sent to LA, and set up with a detective played by Val Kilmer to learn all about being a petty criminal. After running into the girl he loved in grade school, now working as an actress/waitress in Hollywood, he gets drawn into all sorts of nefarious happenings. One reviewer called it the best accidental detective movie since The Big Lebowski. Noir comedy like Kiss Kiss or Fargo or The Big Lebowski takes a particular kind of audience. It's very funny, but it's also dark, suspenseful, and violent. It's like Reese's Peanut Butter Cups, and if you don't like peanut butter, you're not going to enjoy peanut butter cups. And it's the kind of thing that, as a librarian, it's just always important to know your audience when you're recommending movies.
Okay, next genre is drama. Drama's been around since the beginning of civilization. So Adam and Eve with the apple and the snake, it's drama. Basically, if you have people, you probably have drama. And this is the first time I've used illuminate, so bear with me. The ancient Greeks from Roman stage plays. During the Dark Ages, the church dramatized stories and passages from the Bible, and Shakespeare, the greatest playwright of all times, although that's questioned and anonymous, may have made the biggest leap forward in the evolution of the drama. He added a level of sophistication and complexity that was absent from earlier productions. So what is drama? According to Merriam-Webster, drama is a composition in verse or prose intended to portray life or a character or to tell a story usually involving conflicts and emotions through action and dialogue and typically designed for theatrical performance. In other words, drama is a scripted production with emotional content. Drama is the hardest genre for me, anyway, to pin down. While westerns and sci-fi, horror, musicals, they have their own unique elements, drama really doesn't. It can have a romantic storyline, it can be a crime drama, a coming-of-age story, a war film, or even a biopic. In regard to time period and setting, it's wide open. However, most dramas share a common factor. The main character or characters are forced with a moral dilemma, a crisis of conscience, if you will, and that is the point on which the story turns. So rather than bore you with a list of films featuring Casablanca, Gone with the Wind, Citizen Kane, The Godfather, all great films with which I'm sure you guys will be able to find them on your own, I'd like to offer some alternatives. So here's the first of 6. Captain's Courageous, 1937, MGM, directed by Victor Fleming, starring Spencer Tracy, Freddie Bartholomew, Lionel Barrymore, Melvin Douglas, and Mickey Rooney. And it's from Rudyard Kipling's book of the same title. A Grand Banks fisherman rescues a privileged brat who's fallen from a cruise ship. The young lad's sense of entitlement has him demanding to be taken ashore immediately. The captain says, "We'll take you ashore as soon as we fill our holes," and that takes about 3 months. So the kid gets his comeuppance, and through a developing relationship with the crew, he begins to learn what really matters in life. Captain's Courageous received 4 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture, Best Film Editing, Best Screenplay, with Spencer Tracy taking home an Oscar for Best Actor. Tracy also won the following year for Boys Town. Next up, The Best Years of Our Lives, 1946, MGM, directed by William Wyler, starring Frederick March, Dana Andrews, Myrna Loy, and Harold Russell. For the times, this was an extremely frank look at veterans returning home from war. The film deals with class and gender issues, alcoholism, infidelity, and physical disability. Focuses on the challenge that veterans experience and the changes they make in order to come back into civilian life. 8 Oscar wins, including Best Actor for March, Best Picture, Best Director. Next up, one of my all-time favorites, A Touch of Evil, 1958, Universal Pictures, directed by Orson Welles, starring Orson Welles, Charlton Heston, and Janet Leigh. A vacationing police chief helps a corrupt policeman investigating a bombing south of the border. This unnominated box office failure was panned by critics, and yet is proven to be one of the finest examples of film noir ever captured on film. The original theatrical release was 93 minutes, but it wasn't what Welles had in mind because he wasn't involved with the editing of the film. He'd been let go. So Welles wrote a long, detailed memo to the production house with the specifications on how he would have wanted the film to be released. This memo was thought to be lost, but Charlton Heston actually had a copy of it, and it was used to re-edit the 1998 release of the film, which is what you can get on DVD. Dr. Zhivago, 1965, MGM, directed by David Lean, starring Omar Sharif, Julie Christie, Alec Guinness, and Rod Steiger. I have to digress just for a second. Has anyone heard of the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon? How Kevin Bacon is 6 people removed from everybody in Hollywood. I read an article a couple of years ago about someone looking into that, the 6 degrees story, and they found that Rod Steiger, due to the peaks and valleys of his acting career, is actually only 2 people removed from nearly everyone in Hollywood. Okay, back to Dr. Zhivago. It's set before, during, and after the Russian Revolution. It's basically a screen version of Pasternak's novel. It's a love story told from the perspective of the good doctor. 10 nominations with 5 wins, including cinematography, screenwriting, and music. It lost Best Picture to Sound of Music. Now, Dr. Zhivago is very long. It's 197 minutes, but it's a great example of the epic films made during the 50s and 60s, emphasizing human drama on a grand scale. So films like Ben-Hur, Cleopatra, The Longest Day, King of Kings, Spartacus, Lawrence of Arabia, The Greatest Story Ever Told. And I digress again. I was watching an episode of The Office, and Michael is talking about when he saw Spartacus, he was confused when all those people stand up at the end, and he still didn't know who Spartacus actually was. If you show Dr. Zhivago, make sure you have comfy chairs. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, 1975, United Artists, directed by Milos Forman, starring Jack Nicholson, Louise Fletcher, Danny DeVito, and Christopher Lloyd. Based upon Kesey's novel, it's the allegorical tale of the anti-hero wise guy, Randall P. McMurphy, rebelling against the mostly unshakable Nurse Ratched, who rules the institution with a cold, unrelenting authority. The role of the domineering Nurse Ratched was turned down by 5 actresses before Louise Fletcher accepted. And Milos Forman later claimed he originally wanted Burt Reynolds as Randall P. McMurphy. Would have been a very different movie. A little background on Cuckoo's Nest. Kirk Douglas starred as McMurphy in the 60s Broadway production, but he couldn't convince a studio to produce a movie version. So he held on to the rights. His son Michael eventually got backers and made the movie. By that time, the elder Douglas was too old for the starring role. The film cost $4 million to make and grossed $300 million worldwide. It was nominated for 9 Academy Awards and swept the Oscars: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Screenplay, Best Actor, and Best Actress. And it also swept the Golden Globes and BAFTA awards. It's the first film to take all major awards since 1934, when Frank Capra's It Happened One Night did the same thing. And my final drama, Goodfellas, 1990, Warner Brothers, directed by Martin Scorsese, starring Ray Liotta, Robert De Niro, Joe Pesci. Goodfellas was based on the book Wise Guy by Nick Pileggi. But it couldn't be called Wise Guy because at the time there was a popular TV show called Wise Guy starring Ken Wall with Andrew Dice Clay and Kevin Spacey. It would have been too confusing. People going to the movies, they would have been expecting to see Ken Wall, the unibrow hunk, and instead they'd have seen Joe Pesci. So they called it Goodfellas. Goodfellas details the true-life rise and fall of Henry Hill, a half-Irish, half-Sicilian mobster turned FBI informant. The opening narration sets the tone. As far back as I can remember, I always wanted to be a gangster. To me, being a gangster was better than being President of the United States. I've seen this film at least a dozen times. The story, characters, pace, and soundtrack combine for a perfectly mixed cocktail. One caution, this film is not for everyone, so know your patrons. It's a raw, extreme, profanity-laden tale of maneuvering and hustling. Nearly 300 F-bombs. So the grandma who comes in and likes Murder, She Wrote, you may not want to recommend Goodfellas to her. Now, while The Godfather tells the story of organized crime from the perch of those in control, Goodfellas is a story of mob life from someone in the trenches. It received 6 Oscar nominations, with a win for Pesci for Best Supporting Actor. In my humble opinion, Goodfellas should have won Best Picture and Best Director that year, but it didn't. Kevin Costner did for Dances with Wolves.
So on to musicals. The Hollywood musical was a natural extension of the Broadway musical and vaudeville. The Jazz Singer, starring Al Jolson, was released in 1927, and it was not only the first musical, but the first film with synchronized dialogue. It was the voice heard around the world, and by 1929 the silent film era was dead. The 1930s, 40s, and 50s are considered the golden era of musicals. And while there have been hit musicals every decade since then, around the 70s, several poorly promoted musical flops convinced the powers that be that the musical was dead. Hollywood realized that they could make a mint having popular groups provide background music and repackaging hits on soundtrack albums. And musical creative artists like choreographers began putting their energy into music videos. Since then, musical hits tend to be seen as the exception, although there are a handful every year. Lately, it's been a bit of a one step forward, 2 steps back situation, where you have hits like Dreamgirl and Mamma Mia, which convince everyone that the musical is back, and then a film like Burlesque comes along and everyone wishes it was dead again. 42nd Street from 1933, directed by Lloyd Bacon with choreography by Busby Berkeley. Busby Berkeley was one of the first artists to actually choreograph specifically for the movie screen, as opposed to just filming what one might see on a Broadway stage from the perspective of the audience. He filmed extravagant musical numbers from above, creating kaleidoscopic patterns with pretty dancing girls. 42nd Street is also notable because its plot line about a chorus girl who is sent in to replace the big star has become an archetypical storyline, and its memorable line, "You're going out there a youngster, but you've got to come back a star," is one of the most parodied of all time. Bells Are Ringing from 1960 was directed by Vincent Minnelli. Bells Are Ringing is not the best musical ever made. And it's not even the best musical by Vincent Minnelli, whose musicals include Meet Me in St. Louis, An American in Paris, Gigi, Brigadoon, and Bandwagon, to name a few. But it is one of my personal favorites for two reasons. One is that it stars Judy Holliday, who is my favorite actress. Holliday won an Academy Award for playing the dumb like a fox blonde in the film Born Yesterday, but then found herself trapped in a Hollywood that only wanted to cast her as dumb blondes. Frustrated, she left Hollywood for Broadway, starring in the hit show Bells Are Ringing, which she was eventually able to translate to screen. Sadly, it was her last film. She died a few years later from cancer. AllMovie.com says she was a brilliant, singular talent, allowed to perform at only half steam in most of her Hollywood films. But she is full steam ahead in Bells Are Ringing, full of sparkle and wit and song and dance, and it's just a charming, charming story. The second reason this is one of my favorite musicals is that it also stars Dean Martin without Jerry Lewis. And in my personal opinion, there are not enough of Dean Martin movies without Jerry Lewis. So, The Music Man from 1962, directed by Morton DaCosta, based on the Broadway musical by Meredith Willson. You probably don't need us to tell you about this musical. If you haven't seen the film, you've probably seen a community or high school theater production. But it is on my list for a couple of reasons. First, it's just a wonderful ensemble production. Wonderful performances by Buddy Hackett, Hermione Gringold, and little Ronnie Howard make this film just a delight. And it's also not quite a saccharine film, as you may remember. Harold Hill, played by Robert Preston, and Marion Peru, played by Shirley Jones, are both very flawed heroes, and their relationship is based as much on attraction of weaknesses as it is hearts and flowers. But the main reason it's on my list is actually going to be my little librarian moment, is that Meredith Willson was actually a student of John Philip Sousa, the great band leader and composer of band music. And The Music Man is really Wilson's love letter to Sousa. When Sousa retired from leading the Marine Corps band, he formed his own band and traveled across the United States, giving over 15,000 concerts in small towns across the country. It was during this time, the same time period that is shown in this film, that band music took a hold of our country. Small towns built bandstands, and the idea of community and school bands became a thing that Americans now take for granted. And in its own way, The Music Man shows us a slice of American cultural history that's very unique to us. Cabaret, directed by Bob Fosse in 1972, based on his Broadway production of the Candor and Ebb musical. Fosse moves back and forth between Broadway and Hollywood, choreographing and directing shows like Kiss Me Kate, The Pajama Game, Damn Yankees, Cabaret, Pippin, Chicago, and all that jazz. Fosse has a very distinctive style that focuses on jazzy rhythms and a stylized sexuality. Musicals are often dismissed as being lightweight fluff, but actually many musicals deal with dark or challenging topics like religion, racism, civil rights, homosexuality, gang violence, and AIDS. Cabaret is set in Weimar, Germany, and deals with the rise of fascism and Nazism. It also deals with homosexuality, which in 1972 was still, for the most part, the love that dare not speak its name in Hollywood. Cabaret is also on my list for the huge artistic impact it has had on other movies, you know, like Flashdance, Victor Victoria, and generations of artists and designers and fashion. Which brings us, 20 years later, to my final musical, Moulin Rouge, directed in 2001 by Baz Luhrmann. In Moulin Rouge, Baz Luhrmann took opera, rock, pop music, classic and popular fashion, Eastern and Western culture, shoved it all in a blender, and threw it up on screen. The first time I saw Moulin Rouge, I left the theater thinking, what? But then I saw it again, reluctantly. My sister made me go. And I was completely blown away. It just took a while to open myself to the experience. In some ways it's more opera than musical, in that the characters communicate more in song lyrics than dialogue. Though the film is set during the 1890s Belle Epoque of Paris, the music is laced hip-hop style with sound bites of current popular songs, which immediately become earworms that you can't forget. Luhrmann uses a jerky and stylistic cinematography and editing, similar to Guy Ritchie, that makes you feel like you're racing towards an inevitable conclusion. Luhrmann also pays homage to the Bollywood musical, Bollywood being the one place on earth where the music never went out of style. And whether you liked it or hated it, whether it was the chicken or the egg, Moulin Rouge style was immediately everywhere, and it still lingers, influencing fashion and artists. Finally, I can't speak about musicals without mentioning the Disney musical. While experts have been proclaiming the death and resurrection, and death again, of the musical since the 70s, Disney has been consistently producing animated and live-action musicals every decade since the 1930s. They're so successful at creating musicals that while in the past successful musical films were often based on Broadway musicals, today the direction now goes the other way. In 2010, The Lion King and Mary Poppins were two of the top grossing Broadway stage shows, and The Lion King and Beauty and the Beast are two of the top 10 grossing Broadway musicals of all time.
Okay, on to Westerns, also known as the horse opera. The film genre we know as the Western is a product of America, but its origins are not. Cowboy heroes based on Greek tragedy, Arthurian legend, and tales of the samurai. The storylines are simple, featuring easily identifiable themes. Civilization versus wilderness, good versus evil, David versus Goliath. Westerns tend to glorify the values of the past and simplicity of life. Typical settings west of the Mississippi in a period between the Civil War and the turn of the century. The protagonist, with or without a sidekick, usually faces insurmountable odds, but is willing to risk near certain death for the principles in which he believes. You're able to tell the good guys from the bad guys from the color of their hats, and you know justice will be served. It's just a question of when. In this promotional photo for Son of Paleface, Roy Rogers is the good guy. Jane Russell is obviously very naughty because she's in black head to toe, and Bob Hope hasn't decided which side he's on. It can be argued that the first narrative film was a Western. The Great Train Robbery in 1903, directed by Edwin Porter. Porter was a Edison cameraman. The movie was 10 minutes long with 14 scenes. It was filmed at Edison Studio in the New Jersey Park and along the Lackawanna Railroad. So it wasn't exactly the Monument Valley. And you can't talk about Westerns without mentioning the great thespian John Wayne. Wayne was born Marion Morrison in Iowa, attended USC on a football scholarship, but after an injury he dropped out and found work in the film industry. John Ford discovered him working on sets and hired him to be an actor. Wayne made over 200 films, including many, many Westerns, and received the Congressional Gold Medal and the Presidential Medal of Freedom. I asked my 20-year-old son who he thought of first when I mentioned the genre Westerns, and he answered Clint Eastwood, so I asked him to leave the room. While there are many excellent Westerns, for the sake of being brief, I have 6 titles to suggest, and the first one is Stagecoach, 1939, United Artists, directed by John Ford, starring Claire Trevor and John Wayne. Strangers on a stagecoach journey are forced to overlook their differences and band together in order to survive. This was John Ford's first Western with sound, and the first of many he filmed in the Monument Valley. It was John Wayne's breakthrough role and made him a leading man after spending nearly a decade on the B-list. And this film elevated the status of the Western from second billing filler to a respectable genre. Lots of nominations, with the Best Supporting Actor win for Thomas Mitchell. And it was remade in 1966 and again in 1986 as a TV version starring Johnny Cath. Supposedly, Orson Welles felt it was such an excellent film that he studied it while making Citizen Kane. Next up, The Naked Spur, 1953, MGM, directed by Anthony Mann, starring Jimmy Stewart, Robert Ryan, Janet Leigh, Millard Mitchell, and Ralph Meeker. The plot: a former Civil War soldier has lost his home. He becomes a bounty hunter to finance a new start. After tracking a murderer for some time, he's forced to take on 2 less than trustworthy partners, and he offers them a nominal fee for their time. When the partners find out the actual bounty on the fugitive they're pursuing, the agreement begins to unravel. Stewart's role in The Naked Spur is a long way from his role as George Bailey or Jefferson Smith. His character becomes obsessed to a point of being brutal, where you question his sanity. The film was a box office hit when first released, and it was nominated for Best Screenplay. Leonard Maltin claims it's one of the best Westerns ever made. Of the 8 films Stewart made with Anthony Mann, 5 were Westerns. And I should mention that Mann's Westerns were influenced by his previous work in film noir. Mann's idea of the West differed greatly from the traditional values and the simplicity of life that I mentioned at the beginning of this. He saw it more as a darker side of humanity. He saw the West as unforgiving and violent, where life was cheap, no one could be trusted. And Mann's inclusion of flawed and morally ambiguous characters added a level of anxiety to the genre, which was previously unseen. His films were actually a leap forward in the maturity of the genre, and he influenced other Western filmmakers, as indicated in this next film, The Searchers, 1956, Warner Brothers, directed by John Ford, starring John Wayne, Jeffrey Hunter, Ward Bond, and Natalie Wood. The story goes, a brooding man with a dark past is possessed with finding and retrieving his kidnapped niece, and he'll stop at nothing to achieve that goal. So this is where Mann's influence comes in on John Ford. Prior to making The Searchers, John Ford was doing things where he had the easily defined themes, as I was talking about, the black hats, the white hats, Rio Grande, She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, Stagecoach, My Darling Clementine. But in the Searchers, John Wayne is just this dark character. It's hard to tell whether he's a bad man who's doing good things or a good man who does occasional bad things. Wayne won his only Oscar for playing Rooster Cogburn in True Grit, but this was his best acting job. And the Coens, I should, on a side note here, the Coens have done an excellent job with their version of True Grit, if for no other reason Glenn Campbell is not in the cast. The Searchers received no nominations. However, it's been on British Film Institute's Sight and Sound's Best Film list several times. It's part of the AFI's 100 Greatest American Films, and supposedly Spielberg's has said it's his favorite film. Ron Howard directed a remake called The Missing in 2003, starring Tommy Lee Jones and Cate Blanchett. Next up, The Wild Bunch, 1969, Warner Brothers, directed by Sam Peckinpah, starring William Holden, Ernest Borgnine, and Ben Johnson. A group of aging outlaws are working on a final score to ensure a comfortable retirement. Peckinpah wanted to portray the West in a realistic manner, so he abandoned the white hats and high morals of the classic cowboy, not to mention the long-standing production code, and incorporated slow motion, multiple-angled scenes, graphic violence, and crude behavior by the characters. It was the beginning of the revisionist Western. The Wild Bunch received 2 Oscar nominations for screenplay and music, but actually lost to another Western, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. A bit about Peckinpah. He got his start in Hollywood writing for TV shows such as Gunsmoke, Have Gun Will Travel, The Rifleman, and Dick Powell's Zane Grey Theater. I read that Peckinpah felt chaos was an essential ingredient in the artistic process, and he certainly lived by that philosophy. He married one woman 3 different times. Eventually, alcoholism and drug addiction contributed to his demise. The Unforgiven, 1992, Warner Brothers, directed by Clint Eastwood, starring Clint Eastwood, Morgan Freeman, and Gene Hackman. An aging gunfighters hired by a group of working girls to avenge their poor treatment. In an era when extreme stunts and special effects were the norm, Eastwood told a simple story in a simple way about a man with a larger-than-life reputation who bit off more than he could chew, but he chews it anyway. Oscars for Best Picture and Director for Eastwood, Best Supporting Actor for Gene Hackman. And I want to go back to what I said about my son when I asked him who he thought of with Westerns, and he said Clint Eastwood. And to his credit, Eastwood played Rowdy Yates on the TV series Rawhide from '59 to '65. Along with playing Harry Callahan from the Dirty Harry movies, he's probably best remembered for his Man with No Name character in Sergio Leone's spaghetti westerns, A Fistful of Dollars, For a Few Dollars More, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly from the mid-'60s. And those may be, for at least my son's generation, some of the most memorable westerns. So I can't say that he's entirely wrong. My dad's the same age as Clint Eastwood, and I love him dearly, but I could never picture him squinting into the sun and saying something like, "Get 3 coffins ready." And I'll finish with the genre with one of my favorite westerns of all time, Lonesome Dove, 1989, Simon Windsor, starring Robert Duvall and Tommy Lee Jones. It was a made-for-TV miniseries version of the Larry McMurtry novel. McMurtry first wrote this as a movie script in 1971, and he tried to get John Wayne to play Woodrow Call, Jimmy Stewart to play Gus McCrae, and Henry Fonda to play Jake Spoon. That would have been an amazing film. Wayne turned it down. The project was shelved. 10 years later, McMurtry brought the script back out, wrote the book, which the series is based on, and benefited from the delay because Duvall makes the phrase "son of a bitch" sound like poetry.
Science fiction. We begin our science fiction section with some time travel back to the early 1900s. In 1902, the 27-minute black and white silent film Voyage dans la Lune was released about men traveling to the moon. It was created by Georges Méliès, an early pioneer of cinematography and special effects, who experimented with time-lapse, dissolve, and hand-painted cells. By 1927, cinematography and special effects had advanced enough to make Metropolis possible. Directed by Fritz Lang, Metropolis was perhaps the biggest budget film of its time, and it almost bankrupted Germany's UFA studios. The imagery of the film has been and continues to be highly influential, and according to Cyberpunk Review, Metropolis is the first cyberpunk film. And so if you have patrons who are into steampunk, I would strongly advise you to recommend Metropolis to them. I think they would really enjoy it. In the 30s, 40s, and 50s, science fiction was strongly influenced by other genres, particularly westerns, action, and horror films. During this time, science fiction was basically B-movie schlock. I don't pass judgment when I use the term schlock. Great films have started out as B-movie schlock, but studios weren't spending a lot of money on them or casting their biggest stars in them. There was a churn amount quality to a lot of the work, as exemplified by this actor in a gorilla suit with a bucket on his head playing a robot monster in the classic film Robot Monster. Why the robot has a gorilla body, I do not know. Sci-fi started getting bigger budgets and a little bit more philosophical in the 50s and 60s, often pondering deep issues behind the action, such as, why is man so violent? Is your neighbor secretly a communist, I mean alien? Nuclear war is bad for people and other living things. Do you know where your food comes from? Or nuclear war is bad for people but possibly awesome for apes. Stanley Kubrick kicked off the modern era of sci-fi with not one but two revolutionary films. In 1968, Kubrick invented, or perhaps perfected, a new subgenre of suspenseful but also philosophical science fiction, what I tend to facetiously think of as space as a metaphor for the human condition science fiction, with 2001: A Space Odyssey. He also immediately followed it up with a different subgenre, the dystopian totalitarian future science fiction, with A Clockwork Orange. Then, in 1977, George Lucas came along and proved that science fiction could make gazillions and gazillions of dollars. And then in 1982, Steven Spielberg underlined it with E.T. Oops.
I forget one.
Sorry, my slides got a little out of order, but that's fine. Sorry, everybody.
Will you send a list out of all these titles?
I believe we sent copies of all of our handouts to Jennifer already. Did you get those, Jennifer?
Yes, I did. However, my emails are not getting through to the first Tuesday list, which is part of why the word about today's program didn't get out. It's just for some reason my email didn't send those messages. So, Jeremy, can you post those to the website?
I can post them to the website. And Katie, I muted your mic temporarily because we're getting a lot of echo on that.
Okay, so now to a couple, just a scattering of my my favorite science fiction, which is certainly not reflective of everything that is out there. Galaxy Quest in 1999 could definitely be considered a comedy, but I included it in this discussion of science fiction because it is a wonderful homage to that special breed of sci-fi fan, the Trekkie. Galaxy Quest is about the cast of an insanely popular, if cheesy, sci-fi adventure show called Galaxy Quest, who are forced into a real space emergency against evil aliens, and the only people who can really save the day are the geeky fans of the show. Many people who love sci-fi came to it through television, and it's nice to see a movie that honors that. And then actually another movie that comes to us through television, Serenity, 2005, is a space western based on Joss Whedon's cult hit Firefly, but it really totally stands on its own. It's set in a long distant future where man has colonized the stars. The crew of the Serenity get by on import-export work that is often on the far side of legal, and find themselves harboring two fugitives from the Alliance, the powerful bureaucratic entity they've gone to great lengths to avoid. It combines a rip-snortin', rootin'-tootin' ninja cowboy adventure in space with characters that one really comes to care about. It's one of my most favorite films of all time. And then you can't really talk about science fiction without talking about films based on the work of Philip K. Dick. Dick was born in the 20s through the 50s, 60s, Dick was born in the 20s and through the 50s, 60s, and 70s wrote science fiction that has a huge fan base. His stories have various repeating themes, including monopolistic corporations, authoritarian governments, and altered states. There are often plots or subplots dealing with man losing his identity as the world becomes more and more technologically or chemically advanced. The work of P.K. Dick is like catnip to Hollywood, and many of his books and stories have inspired movies. This slide is some of what I would call the lesser P.K. Dick canon, still very entertaining movies, if not quite box office blowouts. And then this, of course, is the greater P.K. Dick canon. Minority Report, Total Recall, Blade Runner, A Scanner Darkly, and The Adjustment Bureau. You know, films based on Dick's work are often notable and compelling for combining fantastic notions of the future with the familiar mundane life with which we're all familiar. And it's often this familiarity rather than the fantastic futurism which makes the story so gripping. They have a real feel of possibility to them.
Okay, for our final genre this morning, we'd like to finish it on a lighter note. So our last genre is horror. Humans are the only creatures on the planet who go to great lengths to scare themselves. Modern horror has its roots in stories humans have shared since the beginning of time. Egyptian mythology is full of tales of part human, part animal beings and spirits to be feared and revered. Classical mythology tells tales of monsters and creatures of the underworld. And venerating the dead is present in many cultures. You could say that horror films of today differ only in format from the poems, stories, and ballads which were told or sung around the campfires of our ancestors. Excuse me. The producers of horror tap into the viewer's fears, fear of the unknown, fear of harm, fear of death, and prey upon our insecurities by incorporating the gruesome, the freakish, and things that go bump into the night into their presentation of character and plot. Horror films do not have to be graphic. Simply suggesting the unspeakable engages the viewer's imagination and starts them down a path, and it's much more terrifying than buckets of blood. The earliest horror films used a Gothic look. They were set in old castles, lots of fog, rain, a lot of night scenes to take advantage of shadows. The main characters weren't your typical 9-to-5 set. Disfigurement, questionable mental stability, and odd behavior were the norm. I should mention that horror films overlap with other film genres, so as in with science fiction, as in Frankenstein, fantasy, as in M. Night Shyamalan's work, and thriller is in Silence of the Lambs, which totally freaked me out and gave me nightmares for a week after seeing it. So we can't talk about horror films without mentioning Universal's Pictures stable of iconic horror monsters. And you guys will be, there's no doubt you'll be familiar with these, but I just want to start out with a little bit of background, because these characters like Dracula had an influence on everything that came afterwards. In 1931, Universal gave us the first big studio horror film, Tom Browning's Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi. Studio press releases claimed that viewers had fainted from the horror, and a silent and Spanish language version were released concurrently. It was followed by Dracula's Daughter in 1936, Son of Dracula in 1943 with Lon Chaney Jr., and House of Dracula in 1945, also with Lon Chaney Jr. And the original Dracula movie paved the way for one of the most popular characters in horror, the vampire. Because without Dracula, we wouldn't have Blade, Buffy, Sookie, or the Cullens. Also in 1931, Universal released James Whale's Frankenstein, starring Boris Karloff. This film displays nearly every archetype of the horror genre: secluded castles, physically challenged or deformed henchmen, uncontrollable monsters, and the townspeople rising up in revolt. Whale's sequel, The Bride of Frankenstein, was made in 1935, featuring pretty much the same cast. And in spite of actually being on screen for a very short time, less than 5 minutes actually, The Bride has become a horror icon in her own right, and an inspiration for such characters as Elvira, Lily Munster, and Morticia Adams. The Frankenstein franchise continued with Son of Frankenstein in 1939, The Ghost of Frankenstein in 1942, starring Lon Chaney Jr., House of Frankenstein in 1945, with Boris Karloff and Lon Chaney Jr. Also, John Carradine appears as Drac, and Wolfman is included in that one as well. In 1974, Mel Brooks released Young Frankenstein, and the reason that it looks so authentic and true to the original sets is because he used a lot of the original props from Whale's productions. In 1932, Karl Freund directed Boris Karloff in The Mummy, where an ancient curse awakens an embalmed Egyptian king. The sequel continues with The Mummy's Hand in 1940, The Mummy's Tune in 1942, starring Lon Chaney Jr. Seems like you couldn't make a horror movie in Hollywood in the 40s without Lon Chaney Jr. In 1944, The Mummy's Ghost, and in 1944 also The Mummy's Curse. And then the Mummy franchise was resurrected in 1999 with Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz, who plays a librarian, in the remake of the series. Several followed after that. In 1935, Universal made Werewolf of London with Henry Hull as the monster. However, the werewolf's popularity didn't really take off until Lon Chaney Jr. starred as the Wolfman in 1941. It was followed by Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman in 43, She-Wolf of London in 46, and its legacy lives on. In 1981, the Wolfman was resurrected in The Howling and An American Werewolf in London. And in 1994, Jack Nicholson played a werewolf opposite Michelle Pfeiffer. The Underworld trilogy with Kate Beckinsale started in 2003. There are 3 movies in it, and it features vampires versus werewolves. So you get a series with a twofer. And then, of course, Remus Mooney Lupin is a werewolf in the Harry Potter books and movies. And the latest Wolfman to screen last year was Anthony Hopkins and Benicio del Toro with a remake of the original Universal classic, The Wolfman, but it was panned by critics and barely made its money back. Additionally, films paired with Abbott and Costello with the characters from the Universal monster stable were made. The first was Bud Abbott and Lou Costello Meet Frankenstein in 48. They went on to meet The Invisible Man in 51, Dr. Jekyll in 53, and The Mummy in 55. While the movies had moments of suspense, they really are comedies. And so Universal, I believe, was doing everything they could to wring every last dollar out of those characters. Now, I don't want to dismiss the next 2.5 decades of production as B-movie schlock, even though most of it was. I'd like to acknowledge the efforts of a few in their attempts to provide viewers with something worthy of their time. So in the 50s, we had Hammer Films, of a British film production company, began producing gothic horror classics. They made series of films with Terence Fisher directing, Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee starring in the iconic horror characters like Frankenstein, Dracula, and the Mummy. And many would argue that these were actually better versions of those iconic horror characters than the original Universal films. In the 60s, Roger Corman, who had featured Jack Nicholson and Little Shop of Horrors, then teamed with Vincent Price and American International Pictures to bring some of Edgar Allan Poe's stories to screen, such as House of Usher, The Pit and the Pendulum, and The Mask of the Red Death. And we'll back up just a little bit to 1960. Paramount Pictures gave us Psycho, directed by Alfred Hitchcock, starring Anthony Perkins, Janet Leigh, and Martin Balsam. Uber creepy Norman Bates runs a motel with his mom. He provides a room for a young girl on the lam. Norman takes a shine to the young lady, but his mother does not. Hitchcock couldn't get a studio to back this, so he financed the film himself and made it for less than $1 million. It's grossed over $50 million worldwide. The shower scene uses over 70 camera angles with 50 cuts and is one of the most violent scenes in cinema, yet you never see Janet Leigh get stabbed. In later interviews, she claimed that she'd quit taking showers. Oscar nominations for director, cinematography, supporting actress, and art, and a Golden Globe win for Janet Leigh. This is an example of how horror films don't have to be graphic and have just, buckets of blood and the gore and all that sort of stuff. Hitchcock understood that if you involve the viewer's imagination, it's way more scary. Next up, White Zombie was maybe it may have been the first zombie film filmed in 1932, but George Romero's Night of the Living Day is the first zombie film to achieve international popularity. And I should mention that zombie films are probably my favorite subgenre of horror. Night of the Living Dead, released in 1968, featured the basic plot for every teen slasher movie that followed. A group of friends get trapped for the night in a rural location, in this case a Pennsylvania farmhouse, when bad things start to happen. In this case, brain-hungry zombies begin to roam. By ignoring the production code and showing graphic depictions of zombies dining on entrails and brains, Romero ushered in a subgenre of horror known as pornography or splatter porn, which opened the door for the teen slasher movies. Night of the Living Dead was made for a little over $100,000 and grossed over $40 million worldwide and spawned 6 sequels and gave us some of my all-time favorite movies. 28 Days Later by Danny Boyle, freakiest zombie movie I've ever seen. Shaun of the Dead, which was mentioned earlier. Dead Snow, which is a Norwegian zombie movie, which is it's quite graphic, but it's very good. And there's some of these they do sort of a tongue-in-cheek approach, as in Zombieland, which was released in 2009. It's a dark human primer on how to survive a zombie-ridden world. And then Zombies of Mass Destruction, which was filmed in our very own Port Gamble, Washington, and marketed as a zombie film with a message. And then the last one that I have up there is The Walking Dead, which is a AMC cable TV channel show based on the graphic novels of the same name by Robert Kirkman, Tony Moore, and Charlie Adlard. And it's a cross between 28 Days Later and I Am Legend. And then the final horror film that I have is The Exorcist, 1973, Warner Brothers, directed by William Friedkin, starring Ellen Burstyn, Linda Blair, Max von Sydow. It's a super freaky journey through demonic possession using special effects for emphasis. This movie scared the daylights out of my friends and me. I remember going to see this in the theater. We had to, my parents wouldn't let me see R-rated movies because I was only 13 at the time. So I told him I was staying at my friend Jeff's house, and he told his parents he was staying at my house, and we camped out in the woods and went to the movies. And like I said, it scared the daylights out of us, but not enough to keep us from buying the soundtrack, Tubular Bells by Mike Oldfield, which is extremely popular for us. One of the most profitable horror films of all time, grossed over $500 million worldwide. The Exorcist earned 10 Oscar nominations and won 2 awards for sound and Best Adapted Screenplay. Lost the Best Picture Oscar to The Sting, another great movie. 7 Golden Globe wins, awards with 4 wins 7 Golden Globe nominations with 4 wins for Best Picture, Best Director, Best Supporting Actress, and Screenplay. The Exorcist spawned 2 sequels and 2 very different versions of a prequel. Regarding the prequel, John Frankenheimer was initially set to direct but stepped down, so he was replaced by Paul Schrader. The producers disliked the film that Schrader made, so they replaced him with Rennie Harlin and screenwriter Alexi Hawley. Harlan refilmed most of the movie. Both versions cost a total of $80 million to produce, and neither enjoyed anywhere near the success of the original. But it is interesting to note that Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist, the Schrader version, which the producers hated, actually made more money and received better views than Exorcist to the beginning, Harlan's effort.
Thank you very much, Katie and John. That was really fun.
Thank
Do we have
you.
any questions?
Well, we hope that this has been helpful, and that you can use it as some building blocks to build your confidence with helping people with movie collections. And we do have handouts and information, and hopefully Jennifer can explain how to get your hands on those, because I'm not exactly sure.
Yes, I saw that my message finally arrived to the listserv. So if you're on the First Tuesday's listserv, you should have those resource handouts. And then Jeremy will post it on our First Tuesday's webpage, which is a public page. It will be there. Ah, he posted the link. There you go.
They aren't posted yet, but as soon as I post the archive later on today, they will be up along with it.
In answer to the question there I see from Anna, one of our handouts is a list of film information resources that John and I both use. The one I visit most regularly is the not particularly exciting but well-known Internet Movie Database. It's sort of a standard, and you can get links for reviews there, although they've recently changed the format and it's a little bit harder to navigate now. But we do have quite a long list, which hopefully is included in those handouts.
Great, thank you. And John listed a link that's his favorite, metacritic.com.